Welcome to another episode of Moral Courage, where we look at the life and legacy, philosophy, theology, stories of our wonderful Rabbi, Rabbi Harold M. Schulweis. Rabbi Harold Schulweis wrote a number of books. Even more were left unpublished when he died. Some are poetic, personal, odes to his beloved Malka. Some are sermons he gave. Many are philosophical or theological. He could quote Kierkegaard and Sartre with the same ease as Talmud and Midrash. He could float between Yiddish and Hebrew as he told jokes or quoted Tanakh. Perhaps most notably was his idea of predicate theology. For most people, the word predicate was left somewhere in their 10th grade English classroom and haven't had the desire to think about it since. So when he preached it, he needed to explain it in a way that a congregant could hear it. One story made an appearance in his 1994 book, For Those Who Can't Believe. And it's in the first chapter. It says, "In our home, the children were put to bed at night with some conversation and a prayer. One evening, my daughter, age 6 or 7, asked the perennial question, 'Where is God?' Following the prayer proclaiming God, the Lord, is one. In her book, Today's Children and Yesterday's Heritage, Sophia Fass, a thoughtful religious educator, suggested a game to answer the where question. I decided to adapt her game with my daughter. I asked her to touch my arms. She did. I asked her to touch my chest. She did. I asked her to touch my nose. She did. I then asked her to touch my love. She stopped for a moment and reached out to touch my chest and my arms. I pointed out that she had already done so. Now touch my love. She couldn't. She smiled. The exercise was an introduction to a deeper understanding of faith." I love that story. Not only does it explain the concept of the ineffable, the unknowable, the ethereal, but it also uses the concept of love to help us understand God. Love has spent many years in hibernation in Judaism. We were taught that Judaism is about guilt, about identifying anti-Semitism, about an unattainable justice system, but it's really about love, about showing up for other people. The God we read about in the Torah is also a God of love, of nurturing, of divine potentiality, to use one of Rabbi Schulweis's common phrases. The idea, through that story, lived in my head for decades. I remember him telling that story. I remember telling other people who questioned God that story. So when I saw the book, Judaism is About Love, I felt seen. Like the Jewish world has caught up to Rabbi Schulweis's example. The book Judaism is About Love is by Rabbi Shai Held, the president, dean, and chair in Jewish thought at the Hadar Institute, which he founded in 2006 with Rabbis Eli Confer and Ethan Tucker. He also wrote a book about Abraham Joshua Heschel, another of Rabbi Schulweis's teachers. But it was his book, Judaism is About Love, which is wonderful, that really hooked me. While I don't have a favorite episode of this podcast, we've gotten to talk to so many incredible people. I've been looking forward to talking to Rabbi Shai Held, who holds a special place in my heart in so many ways. Here's my conversation with Rabbi Shai Held. All right, we're here with another episode of Moral Courage, where we look at the life and theology and all of the different parts of Rabbi Harold Schulweis, who was one of my teachers when I was a kid. We've had incredible guests recently who are, I think the word, like, morally courageous, but also just, I'm so happy. I'm going to try my best not to totally nerd out, that we're here with Rabbi Shai Held, who in so many ways kind of lives up to that gadol status of Rabbi Harold Schulweis, and that through his work at Hadar, through his books about Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was one of Schulweis's teachers in the Heart of Torah, like one of my favorite books maybe ever, Judaism is About Love, which is just incredible. So I'm so happy that you are here today with us, Rabbi Shai Held. What a joy it is to be able to see you and talk to you.
Thank you so much.
I'm also like a follower of the podcast Answers with Held, which did that start with the name? Did that start with an idea? Like, how great to have the last name Held and go like, oh, we could use this.
So it's a little secret that when I was in high school, the sheer chutzpah of being a senior in high school and walking up to the editor of the school newspaper and saying, "I would like you to give me a column." And he said, "Why would I give you a column? You've never been part of the school newspaper." And I said, "Because I have a really good name for it. We're going to call it A Moment with Held." And he was like, "Oh, that's really good. Fine, you can try it. Let's have a column." So it was always sort of in the back of my mind. And then I don't know. I was in a meeting with some staff and we talked about how we wanted to have a podcast where we raised lots of questions and didn't pretend to answer them. And I was like, but we have to use the name withheld in some way. And one of my colleagues said, it's perfect. Answers withheld. And, it'll be like a double meaning. It'll, on the one hand, it's like answers withheld. On the other hand, it says there are no answers. Anyway, so there we go. Answers withheld.
One thing I love is that you don't shy away from any topic. You don't try to teach what Judaism used to say. It seems you're teaching what Judaism really says, what's really going on. You bring in experts of any field. I've heard the name Brueggemann from you more than like any other. If there was like one of those word salads.
I love that. That's hilarious.
Like,
okay.
And I was looking at my bookshelf going, wait, do I have a Brueggemann? No, my Psalms book is by Butenweiser or something like that, somebody else. But you bring in everybody to go like, what is the text really saying? Let's forget about like how it's been interpreted just recently. What did it mean 3,000 years ago and 2,000 years ago? And what does it mean today in a world that's very different? You didn't grow up as a theologian, though. Like, this wasn't the obvious life path for you, right?
That is for sure. I don't know if does anyone grow up a theologian? Are there, on the one hand, all 4-year-olds are theologians. On the other hand, no 4-year-olds are theologians. So it's complicated.
Yeah, I mean, like, right, when I go into the religious school classrooms at my synagogue and like, what questions do you have? And they, like, in a beautiful way, stump me because I go, okay, wait, I got to figure out how to answer this because, I mean, in the 6th
They
grade
are
class
amazing.
this week,
Kids in God
just
questions.
like,
right.
Yeah. And they're trying to understand it. So I grew up with Schulweis as my rabbi, and others amazing teachers as well, Ed Feinstein and Stuart Vogel. I don't know, whoever's listening to this was probably at some point a teacher. But Schulweis's theology from early on was predicate theology, was this idea that God is a verb. And I don't know exactly where I stand on that, but it helps to teach it. To say, like, do you believe that God heals sick people? And if your answer is no, doctors and medicine and science and nurses and chicken soup, all right, then what are we doing when we're saying Mishaberach? Are we saying, God, I hope you like me enough to save Nana? Or are you saying, God, this is my reminder right now that I got to call Nana. I got to go bring her soup. I got to make sure she has medicine. I got to make sure she feels loved. In that case, we are bringing God into the world. I don't know, but you come from a different side of it. How did you come to your philosophy and theology?
Yeah, well, so it's interesting. I mean, I guess there's two ways I could answer this, or probably many ways I could answer it. One is a little bit about the personal story of how I ended up obsessed with these questions, and the other is about sort of the project of centering love in Jewish thought. I'll say, because some of your listeners might find this of some interest, is that I feel like theology kind of, in a way, got forced on me because I always like to say I was raised in a cognitive dissonance experiment. My father was a Jewish studies professor, really like a maskil from Eastern Europe, like a kind of very secular, but obsessed with Jewish texts intellectual. And we did nothing at home in terms of observances. But my father used to say in Hebrew, he would say, Ben sheli am haaretz lo yiyeh. My son will not be an ignoramus. And so I went to yeshiva day school, and pretty hardcore yeshiva day school. And although I have older siblings, and the contrast between what we learned in school and what we learned at home just kind of rolled off them. For me, it was torture. I remember being in 4th grade, coming home and saying to my father something like, Abba, my teachers in yeshiva tell me that God wrote the Torah word for word and gave it to Moshe Rabbeinu on Har Sinai. I know you don't believe that. And then the way I remember asking this, which is, I'm not actually sure how I asked it, but the way you remember things is itself probably important. I remember saying, how can you both be right? And my father, who was really like a philologist, a scholar of ancient languages, didn't have a philosophical bone in his body, basically said, not dismissively particular, basically said, I don't even know what you're asking me. I don't really even get this question. And I found myself obsessed with the question of revelation as a 10-year-old. What is this book called the Torah? And I would say, like, I caught a bug that I've never gotten rid of. And I got lucky along the way in that I discovered through no effort that I had made, that when I would talk about philosophical or theological questions, people would want to engage. And I realized, oh, this is amazing. I could do the two things I love most. I could think about ideas and I could talk to people, and I could do them both. And amazingly, apparently people will pay me a salary to do what I want to spend my time doing anyway. So, it's been this amazing journey of talking about God and questions of theology with Jews. And then since my last book, increasingly with Christians. And I sort of can't imagine doing anything else. I had a conversation. I'll just tell you very quickly that, my wife found this to be just absurd. Last week on Shabbat, I was sitting at the dining room table trying to figure out a passage from a midrash on in Root Rabbah. And my wife sort of walked by and said, "Is that work or fun?" And I said, "I'm sorry, what? What does that mean?" And she was like, "God, you're the most annoying person in the world."
Yeah.
I was like, I don't know what the difference is.
Sure. I mean, but also, like, most of us who get into this line of work do it because we are passionate about it. It's not, we don't usually use the word calling, but it's something that we really like. When I was applying to rabbinical school, my rabbis were like, is there anything else that you want to do? Come on, do something else, which I think is problematic. I think that's one of the reasons that we have a bad pipeline in our movement, is like the rabbis are talking
Right.
students
But the
out of becoming
question,
rabbis.
sorry, I mean to interrupt you, but the question that they're asking, if you flip it, is actually very powerful, which is like, who makes the best rabbi? Someone who is mishugala davar, someone who is really crazy for this, right? A passion that you can't contain. That's the
Sure.
more positive version, right? Is
Well,
looking
and
for
this
that.
is how I live it. And maybe it's just like what I was taught as a kid. And I used to be in the film industry where it's like you work 18-hour days, and that's just what life is. But I don't take days off. And my board comes up to me like every week. They're like, today's your day off. Why are you here? I was like, how do I say, I actually love this? I mean, also, like, there's people in the hospital who have surgery tomorrow. I've got to see them today. And also, there's a holiday or a Shabbos or a bar mitzvah or a wedding or a funeral. Like, things happen and I need to do this. But also, I happen to love it. I love that my office has 1,000, and that's an understatement, books in it. And I can, like, pick one off the wall and kind of know what to expect or discover something new. I happen to love it. But how do you decide what text? I'm asking now as a rabbi, not like as a whatever this is podcast, but like, how do you decide what text to look at? What struck you about the line in Ruth that you're like, I need to see what Midrash has to say, but I need to dive deep into this line?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question because, I'll say something that maybe will strike a lot of rabbis or teachers as obvious, but, it seems to me there's at least two ways to go about thinking about something to say, right? One is to figure out what you want to say and then go looking for a peg. I have tried very hard in my life to steer myself towards the opposite, which is open up a text, read it, see what confuses me about it, see what grabs me about it, and then go hunting. It's
What's
actually
bothering Held?
yeah,
What's bothering
exactly. I mean,
Rush?
look,
Like,
I'll tell you something that I see a lot of conservative rabbis do as a sermon style that I don't have a lot of judgment of, but I don't relate to it at all. Like a lot of rabbis, a lot of very good rabbis will get up and their sermon structure is something like this. So I was in the mall last weekend, and then they tell a story, and then somehow they back through the story into the parsha. I don't really ever do that. I'll just get up and say, "So I was reading the parsha this week, and I was very confused by this." It's much more, I don't know what, direct, for better or for worse, trusting the text to be my launching point and not just my ending point. I think that's a temperament thing. Part of it is probably just actually having been raised in yeshivas, where that's much more the style. You read a
right.
text al haseder, like, from one piece to the next, and you just go through it. And then you stop when there's interesting things to talk about. So, and it so happens, here's the funny thing. When I wrote The Heart of Torah, which is a collection of something like 100, I don't know, 102 essays on the Torah, something like that, I wrote it very much, I would say with very few exceptions. I would like read the Parsha, see what struck me, research it, and write essays. And yet when I finished and I had to write an introduction, I realized that even so, I had somehow managed to write a group of essays that pretty adequately represented what I would have written if I had started on a meta level. You know what I mean? Like my theology basically came out anyway, which just goes to show you that the relationship between like a human being and the texts that they read is so like mutually, I don't even know what the right word is. It's so relational all the way down that what the text is saying and what you're seeking end up meeting somewhere.
Yeah. But somehow you find like you had I think a multi-part series on Psalm 77. Like at some point, which I sent to, we've got a group of guys who study Psalms, who study Tehillim every week here, and they do want, like, they go through in order. And so years ago they were on Psalm 1, and then however long that took, in a week or two, and they were on Psalm 77 for a couple of weeks. I was like, you have to listen to this podcast. I don't know if they did or not, but like, how did that become, of all of them, it's not the most well known. It's not really in our liturgy as far as I can recall.
Right.
But you found this to be the one that you have to spend an hour or more tearing apart and explaining and diving into.
Yeah.
It's
Right.
just like, it's just
So
like asking Bob Dylan how he wrote a song, and he's like, I don't know. I wrote it. It came to me. Like,
well, it's funny. I mean, first of all, that is the first and probably the last time I'll be mentioning the same sentence as Bob Dylan. Thank you for that. I do find, and this is a disappointing thing to say, but a bunch of times in my career, I've been asked to do workshops on how I write Divrei Torah or sermons. And one of the most annoying, I'm sure there are many annoying things that I say, but one of the most annoying things that I say is I've said to a few people, I'm not so good at explaining how I do what I do because it's very intuitive. There are people who are very methodological and people who are very intuitive. I'm like very intuitive. Like, or, the way that I mean, if I'm really being honest, I would say, a moderate case of ADD. And that means that I have read the first chapter of thousands of books. And the positive piece is that I make weird associations that often really resonate with people. So I'll be reading the Parsha and it'll remind me of something I read in a Musar book, which will remind me of something I read in a moral philosopher, and then we're sort of off to the races. But it's hard for me to explain how I do that. When it comes to something like Psalm 77, which I actually have a longer essay coming out about, it's in that particular instance, I got interested in the question of memory in Sefer Tehillim, in the Psalms, and specifically the way the Exodus is remembered. And I realized, I don't know if you want to dive into this for a minute, but I realized that there was a conventional way of talking about memory that it felt to me was not the whole story. And if we told the whole story, it might actually help a lot of Jews connect to these texts. In one sentence, the idea is that very often the Exodus, a lot of Bible scholars write about this, right? Remembering the Exodus brings it back to life and thereby gives you comfort that enables you to survive difficult moments, right? You reenact the Exodus and it's like, oh, I can survive, I don't know, political oppression that I'm going through. And that's fine and accurate, actually. But it's also the case in Psalms that remembering the Exodus sometimes makes the pain of the present worse. Because wait a minute, if God was active and redeemed us then what is God doing exactly now? And so the Exodus in Psalms can sometimes be a way of expressing the sense of devastation and how painful life is. And one of the things that I have found is very comforting for a lot of Jews is to be told that not all piety needs to be conventional and neat and, oh God, you're so wonderful, it's so wonderful. Sometimes real piety in the Psalms can be like, oh God, I can't bear this and I don't understand what you're doing. And so Psalm 77 is just a very powerful example for me. I mean, it includes some of the most amazing verses in the Bible where the psalmist says, has God forgotten how to be merciful? Hashachach chanot el? And it's like, you bring that to a bunch of people. By the way, you bring that to a bunch of people who like went to yeshivas and they're like, that's in the Tanakh. No one ever showed me that before. And so part of it is just about opening the world for people to see that a religious life can be more complicated, more capacious is probably a good word for this, than conventional piety would lead us to think. That's a big piece of what I'm trying to do with a lot of biblical texts. And I guess some of the texts that I'm most drawn to are the ones that shock me. frankly. The ones that I'm like, wait, what? You really, that's in the Bible? That's amazing. And so I try to understand, like, how have Jews read this? How have academic scholars read this? And then often to think, how might this help, a Jew in my class right now? Someone who comes to me and says, my husband just died and I'm trying to connect to God and I have no idea how to do that. Like, are these texts helpful?
In school, somebody said every rabbi has 2 sermons they just give over and over again.
Maybe one more than I have. Yeah.
That, right. I mean, like, and
Right.
do you is yours so much Judaism about love? It's about comfort. It's about being there. It's about people who have been in similar situations to you in the past. King David, even Moshe, even is also had struggles, and if they can get through these difficult moments, this text can teach us how to get through these. Like, is it?
I don't, it's funny. I want to flatter myself and say, I don't think I have one sermon. I think I probably have about 4 or 5, but,
Right. I don't
but
want. I wasn't trying to say that.
yeah, of
I was actually
course.
going to
No,
lead
no,
it to a
no.
different way. But
Right. No, 100%. Of course. I mean, I don't think I have 100 sermons, but I think one of the sermons that I have, which is funny, I wouldn't even say it's a sermon, one of the shiurim that I have, one of the classes that I give often, and there are a lot of different texts that I use to give this class, but is some version of what you just said. So here is a very concrete example from my own life, which is one of the reasons why this became so important to me. And I actually write about this very briefly in Judaism is About Love. I remember, I can't quite tell anymore whether this was actually said to us or whether I just kind of absorbed it in the air. But I remember as a kid internalizing the idea that to be a truly religious person is to meet every situation by saying, in the language of the Talmud, Gamzu Latova. This is good too. And I always found that very alienating. I lost my father very suddenly when I was 12 years old. I was raised by a pretty mentally ill mom. I've dealt with a lot of chronic illness. Like, the idea that I'm supposed to say Gamzula Tova, all this is good about everything, I found somewhere between hard to connect to and at times enraging.
yeah.
And then as an adult, I started reading Tehillim, the Psalms, in a careful way and realizing that a lot of the psalmists would have said, this is for the good? Are you out of your mind? This is awful. I can't take it. And I thought to myself, oh, it would be really interesting to give a bunch of contemporary Jews, many of whom feel that, like, to be religious is to just be conventional in one's thinking, and say, did you know that this is in the Psalms? The Psalms say, hey, God, I can't take this, and you're not doing a very good job. And I find people often, the first time they encounter a psalm of lament, as they're called by academic types, people are often blown away by these texts, blown away by them. And sometimes we do deep dives into, like, what does this Hebrew verb mean? And sometimes we do deep dives into, well, what does it say about my relationship with God? If I can say to God, hey, God, what are you up to? Sleeping? Psalm 44, right? Are you napping? Right? So again, it's like the shiur, that I go back to a lot is, can I open up the world of Torah for Jews in a way that enables them to imagine a much bigger world, a bigger house with more rooms in it than they were taught to imagine, right? It's the interesting thing is that I find that it can it's not for everyone, obviously. It can bring in sort of liberal Jews without a lot of background, but also it really helps people who grew up in very traditional environments and were wounded by a sense that the world was very small. And then you say, oh no, look what Tanakh says. I mean, I've had people literally in classes on Tehillim, on Psalms of Lament, like, just break down and cry. Like, I didn't know this was okay. That's very powerful. And by the way, and that's teaching and pastoral care at the same time. As I'm sure,
Yeah.
I mean, as every rabbi knows, those things verge off into each other in all kinds of ways.
We were talking about biographies before, and yours reminds me a bit of Rabbi Schulweiss's. His dad was an atheist Yiddishist, and his grandfather was a Chassid, was an Orthodox man, and like he was raised kind of between these pulling points. For you, maybe it
Mm.
was your father and your yeshiva, and same thing. And then like Brad Artson, the new Mordechai Kaplan scholar at American Jewish University, when his son was born and was for 8 years, they didn't know what was wrong with him, but they knew that something was wrong. Like it changed his theology, and he found that like he could be angry at God. He could and this isn't new in the 20th or 21st century. This isn't post-Holocaust Judaism. This isn't Harold Kushner Judaism. This is Tanakh. This is in the Bible.
Yes. So what I often tell people is, it seems to me that when you read Tanakh carefully, you realize that the questions are not what's new in modern times. What's new is the range of possible answers people are willing to consider. Right? In other words, that a modern person might say, "Oh God, you're falling asleep. Maybe there is no God." But "Oh God, you're falling asleep" was a sentiment and a question people had, all the way back to the beginning. So 100% that is for sure true, right? And I like to say there's nothing more traditional than asking a question about how God works, right? That's a question the Bible is really, really interested in. You mentioned Walter Brueggemann before. Brueggemann has this wonderful, very Protestant, but still helpful. He says, the Bible has a testimony, right? A story it tells about God, but it also has a counter testimony. That is the experience of, oh, really? That's a story about God? Well, then why did my mother just die? Why did my son just get cancer, right? In other words, and there's jockeying in the Bible itself. That's what's so
Right.
moving about it, or it's one of the things that's so moving about it. But I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's the point of the conversation is interrupting each other. But I, right, how many people have said that they stopped believing in God because something bad happened to them? It's like, where did that idea of God come from? Because that's not the God of the Bible. That's not the God of the Talmud. I mean, like, I bring out brachot, like the beginning. I mean, I know it's not the beginning necessarily chronologically, but the beginning of the Talmud of how it was put together is a bunch of rabbis going like, why do bad things happen to us? We're good people. Why is God punishing us? Is God rewarding us? Is this punishment feeling good for you, knowing that God loves you so much? And to
Right.
know that our questions, our struggles are part of Judaism from forever.
Yeah, and as you know, one of the things that we have not been good at as American Jews is really opening up space for conversations about God. And that's part of that's part of the work. I understand a lot of my work as about that. I mean, I like to say American Judaism is a little bit like a book club where you get together to talk about a 900-page Russian novel, but the only rule is you can't talk about the main character. That's a very weird book club. Now, I think that has changed a lot, but a lot of talk to your congregants who are 80, and I'm sure a lot of them will tell you they grew up with rabbis who never talked about God,
Hmm.
which is just, I think, very tragic, and we have to find a way around that. And one of the experiences I have a lot, I don't know what your experience with this in school was, but I hear from rabbis a lot. You know, I feel like my congregants have a lot of theological questions or even want to learn about the history of Jewish thought, and I don't have the tools to teach them. I never really learned enough about that. And that's like a real challenge. I mean, one of the things I've been doing in my own work these days is I have these ongoing learning groups with rabbis, where we're just like reading modern Jewish thinkers because a lot of them didn't really do it in a serious way. And if they did, then which totally is not their fault. What they did was like, okay, here's a week on Heschel. Here's a week on Rosenzweig. It's hard to really read somebody like that in a week. I mean, it's hard to have any idea what they're talking about. I've been reading Buber my whole adult life, and I'm only now, I feel like it's funny, just now I'm finishing an 8-week seminar on Buber with a group of rabbis, and I think maybe I'm starting to figure out what he was up to. And I'm not trying to be coy or cute when I say that. It's just these are big thinkers.
No, right. I think what's coy or cute is that how many people who are smart, learned, wonderful people can summarize Buber in one short sentence. And like the fact that you're not get just by saying I and thou, like isn't summarizing an entire
It's funny that you
theology.
it's funny that you say that because I actually began my class by saying something like a lot of rabbis have one paragraph they can say about Buber, but almost none have two, right? And
Yeah.
I would like to help you actually have a series of classes to give on Buber, and more importantly, a conversation you can have internally with one of the giant figures of the 20th century.
In undergrad, I took a class on modern Jewish philosophy, and I had to buy the book Star of Redemption,
Oh God,
Rosenzweig. And
that's
so
so
I bought
hard.
it. I have to tell you, so undergrad, I'm supposed to read it. I then go to rabbinical school many years later, and we take classes on modern Jewish, on Jewish philosophy, not only modern. It's still on my bookshelf, and it's still wrapped in plastic. I have never even unwrapped the plastic of that. I've read Rosenzweig, but it's hard to get into it. That's just me. I shouldn't have shared that with anybody.
It's not just you. Trust
but
me.
but also, like, where do you think this overlay comes in, that Jews or American Jews or post-Holocaust Jews think that Judaism or God is one thing, and therefore doesn't speak to them anymore because we live in a world of science, we live in a world of tragedy? Is it Greek? Is it Christian? Is it Puritan? Is there a place that you see this first coming and going, oh, we changed our theology here?
Well, so I think it depends what we're asking. If we're asking about changing our theology or we're asking about American Jews shying away from theology altogether. I mean, because in a way, those are different questions. They're probably related. I suspect two things that I would say, neither of which I could particularly defend, but I'll just go for it. One is that, when modern secular society emerged, when we had the Enlightenment, Jews very quickly intuited that they were the ones who had the most to gain from it. They thought they could finally live in societies that were not Christian. They felt they had a tremendous amount to gain from secularity, and so they became the cheerleaders for secularity. I think you still have that in a lot of Jewish communities, kind of like a kind of just discomfort with, you know, religion, and religion in the deep sense of like emunah and practice, right? Faith and practice, right? As opposed to religion as like a cultural form, say, right? Like something that we do. The other thing is, I think, look, my sense, certainly having taught a lot of people who are a generation older than me, is, for a long time, there was a conversation in Jewish theology that became known as post-Holocaust theology. And that conversation eventually ended. And sometimes in my more morbid moments, I think that conversation ended because for a lot of people, the questions won, right? People just sort of felt like, I don't know how to talk about God. And now I think you have a generation of younger Jews who are like, wait a minute, that's not my personal trauma. Like I want, and then there's a kind of silence that they were met by. I am less convinced than a lot of people, to go to your first question, that what we need is different God image. I sometimes think what we need is a richer and more complex portrait of the way Jews have always talked about God. Refer back to my Psalms of Lament. Like one of the ways that I think I understand the task of theology very differently from say Rabbi Schulweis, who I had great admiration for, but predicate theology is a very moving image to me, but it doesn't really do anything for me, right? I don't say ata, you, to visiting the sick. I say ata to a God who wants me to visit the sick on his behalf. Like that, it's very, very different for me. In that sense, my understanding of God is much more traditional, I would say, than Rabbi Schulweis's. But I guess on some level, the main thing I would like is just open up spaces for Jews to search for God in a way that doesn't feel inhibited or embarrassed, right? Like to be able to say, I intuit that there is something transcendent, there is something beyond me. My life refers to something greater than myself. Can you help me figure out how Jews or other humans too, right, have thought about that? Because I don't have language. And I find this, I mean, Ari, I'm sure you've seen this too. Like you go into a shul. I mean, I for my many sins, I've probably taught at, I don't know, 125 conservative synagogues. I'm guessing, I don't know, something like that, right? So you walk into a room, at some of these synagogues, half the congregation has a PhD, right? You're sitting there like, you're talking to a guy who's a PhD in biology, but he's never been taught Jewish ideas at a higher than seventh grade level. And so, of course, he thinks Judaism is sort of stupid deep down because he doesn't have the same level of intellectual discourse, around Jewish ideas, let alone around theology. So, like, can we actually talk to Jewish adults as adults about God? Right?
Mm.
I mean, Jews are often, I'll just tell you, people are often shocked, which is so funny to me when I will get up in front of a room and someone will ask me a question about God and I'll say, I have no idea. And people will just be like, what do you mean you have no idea? I thought you're supposed to be like an expert. I'm like, an expert on God? What is that exactly? I mean, I might be sort of an expert in the history of Jewish thought, but not an expert on God. I don't even know what that would mean,
God
right?
hasn't come down and revealed God's true self to you.
Right, Rabbi Louis Jacobs, one of the great conservative rabbis of, I guess, now 2 generations ago, he has this wonderful line. I always laugh to myself about this. In one of his books, he says, some theologians speak as though they had just had lunch with the deity, right? It's a great sentence, right? I don't want to
Yeah.
ever talk like I just had lunch with God. I didn't.
But you're aware of the fact that, like, one of the problems that people have with God is this idea of omnipotence, of omniscience, that, and like, these don't seem to be Jewish ideas. They seem to be some sort of Greek or some other overlay onto our theology. And so people walk away going, well, if, right, Shoah, right. Yitz Greenberg had a great line on a Hadar podcast that was, don't have any theology that you couldn't say in front of burning children in Auschwitz. But which
Mm-hmm.
is heartbreaking. When I've shared that with other people, I change it to, like, I used to be a chaplain at Children's Hospital.
Mm-hmm.
What is a
Right.
theology that I can hold to put the Shoah aside for
Right.
some of these conversations? Because it shouldn't all come down to that. But if it doesn't make sense to say to a family if it doesn't make sense to say to a 12-year-old Shai Held, whose father dies suddenly, who is going through chronic illness, like, if it doesn't make sense there, that's not the right theology, right? I
Yeah.
also don't
So
believe in that God.
I think that's right, except I think, not except, I think that's right. And sometimes I find that people respond to the dogmatism they encountered with a kind of dogmatism of their own. Meaning, like, I'll give you an example. I had a colleague who used to sometimes say, and it really bothered me a lot, and actually heard a lot of rabbis say this, oh, I don't believe in a man in the sky with a long beard. And I would sometimes say to him, most people who believe in a personal God also don't believe in a man in the sky with a gray beard. It's not just because you might have felt excluded by traditional theologies doesn't mean you get to make fun of them or make them sound like they're 4 years old.
Hmm.
Right? Like, in other words, what I'm saying is, I'm saying this coming at what you just said at an angle. On one level, in the presence of let's say a pediatric oncology unit, there's nothing at all you can say. Nothing at all you can say. And on another level, there's many things you can say. Some things you say will speak to some people. Some things you say will speak to other people. And the response to that, it seems to me, is like a very large dose of humility. You understand what I'm saying? Like, in other words, it's funny. There's a Yitz Greenberg, who you mentioned, who was my teacher. There's one of the most obnoxious book reviews I've ever read, and I may be misremembering this. This was like 40 years ago, but just just give me a minute to play this out. So Rabbi Greenberg wrote in an essay in the 1980s. It was the line that you're alluding to, and it had huge impact on both Jewish and Christian theology. The sentence is, I remember it by heart because it was so formative: no statement, theological or otherwise, should be made that would not be credible in the presence of burning children. Right? Maybe I'll say it one more time just for your listeners, right?
Hmm.
No statement, theological or otherwise, should be made that would not be credible in the presence of burning children. He writes this at near the beginning of like a 50-page essay. And Michael Wiesegrad, a fellow modern Orthodox theologian, reviews the book that this essay appears in, and he says, it's so interesting. Rabbi Greenberg writes this sentence and then goes on for 50 more pages. And Wiesegrad says, that is really confusing to me. because you would think after you said that you would just sit there quietly, right? But it turns out there are a lot of things you can say, right? You just, now this is me, not Wishagra, saying
Right.
you just have to say them apologetically and humbly and realize that sometimes people will say, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it. You know, I used to volunteer at an Alzheimer's unit, and I used to joke with the chaplain of the home, who's a wonderful chaplain, about like which one of us could get thrown out of a room just by introducing ourselves as a rabbi. Right? I'm sure you've had that experience, or maybe you haven't, but I literally walked into a room and said, I don't ever introduce myself as rabbi, but here I was told that was part of my, I said, hi, I'm Rabbi Held. And the guy looked at me and goes, get out. And I was like, wow, okay. Okay, like, so right now there's tremendous amounts of either rage at religion or rage at God or whatever it might be. And okay, like, and part of being a chaplain, I think, is actually giving someone the power to throw you out of a room.
Yeah, I had that at Children's Hospital too, and it's not it's not a time to talk theology, right? Like I don't walk into any of those rooms and go, "Do you want to know why God is doing this to you?" Actually, do you want me to
Right,
share?
right.
Like,
Oh,
and
yes.
there were parents who like there was a guy, I don't know, huge guy, 6'5", just a big mountain of a man, and I'm a petite fella, and he's got tattoos all over. He goes, "Is my kid sick because of something that I did?" Like, no, like that's just not how this works. I'm thinking maybe in your theology it does. And I can tell you what I think, and I don't know if my job here is to tell you like actually let me quote this essay by Rabbi Shai Held who says,
No,
you
but
know,
it's funny, Ari, because I would say most people don't want to talk about theology in a pediatric oncology unit, but then occasionally you meet someone who actually does. Like, it's funny. I had this conversation once with what you mentioned before, Rabbi Harold Kushner. He and I once had this conversation, and I wasn't sure he agreed with me, but we had this kind of little. He's a wonderful, sweet person, and he had the line he used to say, "When people ask you why is this happening to me, what they're really asking you for is a hug." And I said to him once, we were talking, and I said, Harold, what bothers me when you say that is I feel like 95% of the time that's true. But 5% of the time, they really want to talk about theology. And if you hug them, they actually think your response is condescending and that you haven't heard them.
hmm,
And so the challenge is you have to actually intuit what they're really asking for. And it was like an interesting, and I don't know if he was really able to consider that. Oh, I shouldn't say it was. I don't mean that in a dismissive way. I mean, I think for him, it was so burningly obvious that is a pastoral question. And to me, it was like equally obvious that it's a pastoral question most of the time, but not all of the time. I mean, I have had conversations about God in hospitals, not often, but I've had people who wanted to, this was the moment in which they needed to take apart the theology that was damaging them.
right. Also, as preparing for a funeral, to sit with a family, and you're all
Right.
sitting around their living room or my office or wherever we are, and I've got my notepad out, and I want to, and we talk about, and they bring up theology, and it's that, right. Part of it is like, what is it that you believed your whole life, and does that make sense in moments like this?
So you tell me though, was I right in my challenge to Rabbi Kushner? Because it sounds like you're saying there are moments where people do come to you and they do want to talk about theology in crisis.
Sure. Look, religion is in some ways like, how does this world make sense? Whether you're a nothing person or a Jew or a UU or a Catholic, whatever. Like, how does this world? We're on a floating rock in outer space, spinning at 1,000 miles per hour. Like, what is the point of all of this? How does it make
Right.
sense? And we're like Judaism. Maybe I don't know, I'm making this up right now, but like Judaism is saying there there is something benevolent going on.
Hmm. It's a
And
nice way of
and
putting it. Right.
and
Hmm.
like, and then the struggle is to say, oh, so this person dying suddenly, this child who's sick, is that part of the plan? No, there's not a, for me, there's not a plan for it, but there is. I think Schulweiss's line was, God is in our response to evil.
Hmm.
God isn't in the genocide in Darfur. God isn't in the Shoah. God isn't in the pediatric oncology, but God is in the people who take the time out of their day to show up. God is, I mean, so that for him, that's the verb, that God is in the response is how we show up for each other.
Well, I
People,
think what I understood Harold to be saying is that God is the response, whereas I would want to say God is in the response.
mm, I mean, like, right. He would give a sermon and say, there's two words missing from every prayer, which is through me.
Right.
God, you know, blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who through me feeds the hungry.
Right. So I get, but it's interesting. So, look, it's been many years since I've read Rabbi Schulweiss's theological essays, but I always sensed a tension there between this kind of radical thing he wanted to say, which is like visiting the sick is God, what he called the gerunds of God, right?
Right.
And then a somewhat more traditional God visits the sick through me. Those are not the same thought. My sense is that he was torn between those thoughts. I don't know. I mean,
Mm.
I didn't really, I would be curious what Eddie Feinstein would say about that. Like, meaning, was that actually how he experienced Rabbi Schulweiss? But I hear two different things there. One is like, oh, God is revealed through us. I would regard that as a somewhat more traditional sentence. I mean, I
A little
myself, I've written
Huberian
stuff
or
like that,
something.
right? And then visiting the sick is God, which I would regard as a radical, non-traditional sentence, which I have trouble understanding what that really means. It sounds to me like a way of saying what I value most is visiting the sick, which is fine. I mean, that may be what you mean, but I don't know that. I'm not sure I have fully grasped what Rabbi Schulweiss was saying with those more radical formulations.
Also, this idea of like the room is filled with, right, my shul in the small corner of northern Los Angeles, whatever, is filled with brilliant people who are successful in their careers of whatever they're doing, teachers and doctors and lawyers, whatever. And I think they're having this hurdle of, I don't speak Hebrew, I don't know what the prayers mean,
Mm,
and this theology. And so even when they look at the Siddur and they look at the English side of the Siddur, do we believe this? Is this right? Like, and how do
right.
can we edit? We don't, but can we edit the Siddur to make it make sense? And especially like high holiday liturgy of like, we are clay, we are glass, God is molding us, God is deciding our fate, God decides who will live and who will die. And like, I think people are going, I don't know, I am a pharmaceutical expert, I understand chemistry, what are you saying? For me to go, like, I have to interpret each one
Yeah.
and help people find a theology that makes sense for them. Because maybe you're right, I shouldn't be making fun of the old man, the beard on the throne in the sky. There are Jewish texts that say that.
Yeah, but I think I'm saying something else. It's not that there are Jewish texts that say that, but also I think as a rule, I mean, this is just sort of like something that, I certainly, let me just be clear. I fall short of this plenty of times. But can we learn to hear each other in the most generous possible light? And when Jews who have a more liberal view of the world feel slighted by Jews who have a more traditional view of the world, they often return the favor, they respond in kind. And I just wish we didn't need to do that.
Yeah. Me as I grew up, I don't know, conservative. I'm a conservative Jew. I now a rabbi at a conservative synagogue where I got smicha from a conservative institution.
Right.
And I do feel this prickliness when somebody who's far more observant even comes to me. We had somebody at our shul this week who was wearing a black kittel with the belt and wouldn't take their talis off and wouldn't come into services. And I go like, are we I think more than anything, I want to sit down and be like, tell me your theology. Tell me how you
See,
got to
but
where
that's
you
wonderful
are.
because that is exactly what I'm talking about, which is but that is a posture of whatever discomfort you have, you're responding with curiosity rather than judgment. That's what I'm encouraging, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and I think that that's hard for a lot of us. Look, it's one of the ways I think interfaith dialogue needs to work, right? Interfaith dialogue ideally should not be about proselytizing to each other. It's like, oh, Jesus Christ is your Lord and Savior. Can you tell me what that means to you?
Yeah.
Or when, or Christians I really admire who have said to me, I understand like you don't think Jesus was God at all. Like, tell me about the nature of the covenant with God. Like, and they're actually, it's a posture of, let me learn from you and about you. And I guess I feel the same way in conversations within religions, where it gets hard for a lot of people is to maintain a posture of curiosity towards people who may not have curiosity about you, right?
Yes. Right,
So,
right. It might not see me as even really Jewish or
or authentic, let's put it that way.
authentically
I
Jewish.
mean, I think they would say, there's no Haredi I'm aware of, no ultra-Orthodox rabbi who would say you're not Jewish. They might
Sure.
say you're not authentic, and they certainly don't want to hear what you think.
I think for me, I'm worried about opening it up and hearing them go like, I never actually thought about what prayer means. I just recite it. And
Yeah,
like,
but my instinct is, Ari, you got to give people more credit than that.
oh, I know. I'm nervous for where that conversation is going to go, right? Like
Hmm.
it feels, it's one of those
Right.
touchy points. And so that's
No,
why
I totally get it.
maybe that's
Yeah.
why I love your book and Sarah Hurwitz and Sharon Bress, all these people who have this view of Judaism is loving and embracing and welcoming, and that I'm so appreciative that there is a generation of brilliant people, sorry to put you in that category, who are writing books about Judaism that is not based in anti-Semitism. It's not a response to, I have a whole section of my library that's post-Holocaust literature and liturgy and theology. And I'm so grateful to have a section in my library that is loving Judaism, I mean, just, it's such a
Right.
wonderful thing. And I'm just so appreciative that that writing is out there, that Hadar is out there, putting out incredible, accessible content in every form.
Thank you.
I,
Thank you.
I wish I lived in a place where I could be a real part of the conversation, where I could be in those rooms. I love when I listen to a podcast and whoever the teacher is will start by saying, like, it's so nice to have some of you in the room. And you hear questions sometimes only barely because, like, there's a microphone in front. To be there, like, how do I plan a trip to New York where, like, yeah, I'll see some Broadway shows and I'll whatever else I do, and
We
also
have our annual rabbis conference. Rabbis from LA, come. I'll
I know,
start
I
look.
know it's
I'll start nudging you. You
I
just
love it.
open
And
the door.
also like we have there's a fire going on not far from where we are
Oh,
right
right,
now,
right.
and which thankfully for the moment we're great, we're fine. The last time we had a major fire here a year and a half ago, when all of LA seemed to be burning, Hadar reached out to me. I have no relationship really with Hadar aside from, I think that I'm just a fan and a listener. And one of the heads of Hadar reached out and said, just wanted to check in on you. And I, like, just to open that email. And I'm used to getting emails from Jewish organizations that's like, here's what we're doing, give us money. And for this email to just be a simple, from one of your colleagues saying, just wanted to check in, I thought, this is what Judaism can be, right? If I, my one sermon that I've given now for 15 years or whatever is community,
Mm,
show up for each other,
right.
minyan, like this idea, like to be at somebody's house for Shiva, even when you didn't know the deceased and you barely know the mourner, is so incredibly holy. To be there for people and bring some cookies is just does so much for
Yeah.
Judaism. And so the fact that here I was in a moment of crisis, and Hadar, as an institution and as individuals, reached out to go, I want to check in on you. This for me is Shulweisian. It's God. It's what we're supposed to be doing. So
Yeah.
thank you for being the president, the dean, a founder, part of something that's just, I think, changing the face of Judaism, bringing up many questions, even if the answers are withheld. But
Drop
but
the
but
mic
but
and walk out now.
I know, like, I should just be done there. So thank you, and thanks for taking the time today to be here with us. We end by asking if there's a text, a book, a sugya, a mishnah, a prayer, a novel that is haunting you, that is fascinating you, that is disturbing you, anything that you're reading right now that you want to share.
Such a good question. This might be a little obscure, but since you asked, anything that is fascinating me now, in my class that I alluded to on Buber, we talked this week about this one sentence that Martin Buber writes that I think is really interesting. It's very confusing, right? He says, "The man of today has no access to a sure and solid faith. but he is not denied the possibility of holding himself open to faith. One more time, the man of today has no access to a sure and solid faith, but he is not denied the possibility of holding himself open to faith. And that image of faith as not something that we have or even can have, but as something we hold ourselves open to, I don't totally know what it means, but I think there's something very important there. This posture of trust that maybe there's something out there, there's some meaning in the world that we can access. Maybe there's someone out there who values and cares about us. I mean, this was maybe not the kind of answer you wanted. It's not a traditional Jewish text, but it's such an interesting sentence. Like the confession that faith is something hard to have in our world, and yet that's the beginning of the conversation, not the end of it. That actually feels, now that I'm saying it, maybe this is why I thought of it just now, in line with so much of what we've been talking about. Faith is not a possession. It's more like a posture.
I think people know so much and they don't think about belief. They don't think about emunah, about faith. They want to know something. And here they are. And so something to struggle with, to grapple with, to then be told that it's not true. And then to go back to the drawing board. Okay, now if that version doesn't work. No, it's a great answer to bring something you just taught, something you're grappling with, something that's Martin Buber, who was
my students, a group full of rabbis. They couldn't stop sort of like talking about, arguing about, what does he mean? How does this speak to me? How does this describe me? How does this describe my congregants? It was kind of amazing.
I love when one line just either sticks with you, or I teach a Torah class. It's Friday mornings. It's one of my favorite parts of the week. And sometimes we go through the Torah very slowly. It started with Bereshit 1:1, Genesis 1, and we're after 4 years, we're in Genesis 32, I think. And sometimes we just spend a whole week or 2 weeks on one line, one word. What does this mean, Garti?
That is Jewish learning, right? At its best.
And it's the best. And here's a group of people who come and going, I don't really know anything. I'm a nobody. I was a housewife I don't know what I'm doing. And they take a lifetime of experience and knowledge, and they're not quoting Rashi and Radak to me, which is good. That's my job, is to bring Radak to them. They're bringing a lifetime of worldly knowledge, and it's just so wonderful to Judaism, just to take one line. Let's think about this. Let's tear it apart. Let's find the 10 different angles on it. Well, thank you for bringing in a little bit of Buber. Thanks for being here today. This is a dream. So thank you so much for taking the time today.
Really enjoyed. Thank you.
And nice to learn together.
Thank you.
And we'll put in the notes or wherever it is, all of your books, your podcasts, all of the forward in the Newsweek, calling you the greatest Jew who ever lived. Stop. Stuff. Yeah. So really appreciate it. Anyway, have a wonderful day.
You too. Be well.
Thank you for listening to the Moral Courage Podcast. We are produced by the Harold M. Schulweis Institute at Valley Beth Shalom, which supports these podcasts in addition to educational programs within Valley Beth Shalom, the Schulweis Library, changing exhibitions at the Liner Chapel at VBS, Jewish World Watch, and the Jewish Community Children's Choir. The Moral Courage Podcast is hosted by Rabbi Ari Averbach. Our consulting producer is Esther Kostanowitz. Our technical producer is Eric Weiser. We are grateful for the support of the Institute and Haley Lazitsky-Weiser at Sadcon Productions. To learn more about Rabbi Schulweis or to make a donation to help support these podcasts, visit the Institute website at hmsi.info.